and it just climbs off all by itself. It does it itself. Okay?
Yeah, you're right there with me though.
Every time I open the hangar door to go flying, I realize that I'm one of the lucky guys doing something that I dreamt of as a kid.
This is one of my latest acquisitions here. It's a World War I German Albatross fighter. It's got a streamlined wood fuselage, and it was a classic airplane in World War I. This thing it's beyond just being an airplane. This thing is a piece of art. They even went back, they found the original nails in Germany. Everything is just reproduced to a very high standard. The cockpit has got some fascinating things in it. It's done exactly the way it was in World War I. Of course, the Germans had their wild paint jobs more so than any of the other Allied airplanes and fighter pilots. World War I airplanes, they had no brakes. They had a tail skid in the back that used to drag in the grass. That actually was their brakes, so as long as the tail was down, you could maintain your speed. Now, you know, anytime I get the chance to fly these things, I can't help but imagine what it must have been like back then when, you know, they were just kids basically flying them, 18, 19 years old, you know, going out on an airfield, not knowing what was going to happen. That particular mission must have been a very interesting time. Go!
The wings of flying things had cast shadows on the sands of these beaches for millennia. But today, this day, the shadows are different. No, these new wings are man-made and engine-powered. They're capable of being controlled in 3 dimensions of freedom by a pilot. These, at last, are the wings of man's ageless dream made real. The people who saw what happened that day understood what they were seeing, what it meant. Well, looking up, Johnny Moore, a young man who lived with his widowed mother in a shack up in Nag's Head Woods, hesitated for a moment and then tore down the beach, shouting, "They done it! They done it! Damned if they ain't flew!"
Flying means many things to us. It is a timeless dream of the human race and the defining technology of the 20th century. 100 years ago, when Wilbur and Orville Wright broke the code with the first manned, powered flight, they fathered an extended family of flight. Like most families, this one holds reunions. 50 years ago, the largest, most important annual gathering in all of aviation was started as the convention of the Experimental Aircraft Association. In the next hour, we'll visit the centennial of flight as it is celebrated during EAA's Air Venture OSHKOSH 2003. And we'll look at the current state of the technological, social, and economic revolution that began with the Wrights' first flight a century ago. Hi everyone, I'm Ron Corning. Here in the central Wisconsin community of OSHKOSH, direct descendants of the Wright brothers will mingle with the first man to exceed the speed of sound and the first man to walk on the moon. The Secretary of Transportation, the administrator of the FAA, members of Congress, and even fighter pilots just back from Operation Iraqi Freedom will gather together with hundreds of thousands of members of that extended flying family. It's as if, each year, for a brief enchanted time, the members of Cooperstown gather to play on a literal field of dreams. The OSHKOSH fly-in has attracted more than 10,000 airplanes and an estimated 700,000 visitors. Much of what brings them here and much of what has driven the incredible evolution of aviation over the past 100 years is our seemingly boundless desire to access the skies above us. Historian Joseph Korn contends that our love affair with flight is nearly religious in nature. He writes, starting with railroads in the 19th century and continuing with computers today, Americans have long associated their technologies with progress and hope. Because airplanes operated in the heavens where God traditionally dwelled, they generated particularly utopian hopes. In the 1920s, Americans coined the phrase the winged gospel to describe the religious enthusiasm they felt for airplanes. The expectation that personal wings with flying horseless carriage lay just around the corner spread rapidly once airplanes were invented, and soon many believed there would be an airplane in every garage. Much is said and written during this centennial gathering about our rapid progress from the sands of Kitty Hawk to space travel. But perhaps just as surprising is the love that tens of thousands of today's AirVenture flyers still retain for the most rudimentary forms of getting airborne. A full century after the Wright brothers built the first successful airplane, thousands of individual home builders still build and fly their own aircraft. This year alone, nearly 25,000 airplanes, or some 10% of the U.S. general aviation fleet, are considered home-built. The fact is, the very origins of the Experimental Aircraft Association and the annual OSHKOSH fly-in are rooted in this 100-year-old tradition of do-it-yourself airplane building.
I didn't realize that so many people throughout the world had a same dream of building an airplane as I did. So it really was the basis of bringing together people from not only our country, Canada, but from all over the world together who loved airplanes, would like to build one and needed help.
Coming out of World War II, everybody assumed that there would be a huge boom. You had all of these pilots coming back and everybody was going to want to learn to fly. And there was a boom in 1946 and 1947. What history demonstrated was how quickly that spurt in demand was satisfied. And in fact, the gap between the airplane the enthusiasts wanted over here that would be easy to fly and inexpensive and all that, and an airplane that a manufacturer could really build and afford to sell was pretty big. The beauty of the EAA, the beauty of the home building movement and so on, is that it closed that gap. People could say to themselves, well, you know, if I can't afford to go out and buy one of those big, beautiful things that they're selling out there, gosh, that doesn't have to keep me from flying. I can build one myself, and I can build a better airplane than those guys are building. You know, I can use these kinds of new materials to build my airplane, and I can do what I want, and so on and so forth. And that's why I think home building has become sort of the great social movement of aviation in the second half of the 20th century.
The success of the Wright brothers represents two enduring traditions of aviation which remain fundamental to today's home-built movement. The first is the desire of individuals to create and fly their own airplanes. The second is the opportunity to pursue this activity here in the United States.
The reason that so many people build their own airplanes and it's so popular today by comparison to the last couple of decades is the same reason that it's been for the last 50 years. It's about desire and it's about the opportunity. The desire of people to fly, the desire of people to create something of their own creation that they might fly, or to work with their own hands, to work with their own creativity and their own innovation, is the desire that's fueled why people have wanted to fly and why they've wanted to build what they're going to fly for many, many years. In the United States, we're very fortunate also to have the opportunity. Many other countries around the world as well. In the United States, we have a framework of regulations that permit us to be able to build aircraft, test them in a restricted and safe fashion away from the public, and then to be able to use those aircraft. It's fundamental to what we have in America and the freedoms that we have in America to have the opportunity to build our own aircraft as well. And those are the two things. Desire and opportunity are the two things that have made home building as popular as it is.
In recent years, home building has become more sophisticated and standardized, with many proven designs being marketed as kits.
The home-built movement has gravitated toward kits. When I first started coming here in 1976, there was a huge variety of airplanes, of individuals' designs, plans, modified plans that were built without a kit. Then kits were quite basic, pretty much a pile of materials. And then maybe 15 years ago or so, the FAA's attitudes changed. Certainly EA's support helped to create a very refined airplane that was offered in kit form that could be built much more quickly, and when you were finished, you had an airplane whose performance was predictable, was understood. When you were building it, you knew the utility and activity you could do with it, whether it be aerobatic, transportation, fun, sunny day. And so I think I see that is going to be the trend, is that the kit companies offer a parallel outlet to the certified factories where you are able to get the airplane you want, but you add your own sweat equity and enjoyment of building it to achieve the end.
The fact is, the Wright brothers were the first home builders. In a sense, it's almost as if Wilbur and Orville have become guests of those who are celebrating the 100th anniversary of their accomplishment here at OSHKOSH.
These guys took an enormous giant step forward, and you look back to the last 100 years, you know, we're taking shots at Mars now. We've had a man on the moon. That's old conversation. I would congratulate them. I'd tell them what they started. I'd tell them where it has gone and what people will predict for the future.
I think they would be in awe. I know I am in awe of how far we've come in 100 years, certainly. But I think they would be in awe of where we are today here.
Home-built aircraft are a massive part of the Centennial celebration at OSHKOSH, and they are likely to play an even greater role in the next century of flight. The centerpiece of this year's Centennial celebration at OSHKOSH is a pavilion known as Countdown to Kitty Hawk, a traveling display that was commissioned by the Experimental Aircraft Association.
We wanted to come up with a concept that would be a year-long celebration, not just a singular event. And we wanted to build off the assets that we had, which is our membership, their participatory atmosphere, and two key events, Lakeland and OSHKOSH.
To celebrate the centennial, EAA commissioned Ken Hyde, noted Wright brothers historian and founder of the Wright Experience, to create a faithful reproduction of the airplane that started it all, the 1903 Wright Flyer. The airplane and its remarkable story have been on a nationwide tour that began in Lakeland, Florida in April of 2003. On December 17, 2003, the plane's historic journey will come to an end at the Wright Brothers National Monument at Kitty Hawk. At exactly 10:35 a.m., Hyde's team will attempt to fly his famous reproduction from the very same spot that the first flight was achieved. At least part of the kinship these OSHKOSH attendees and other participants in aviation feel for the Wright brothers is the sense of possibility they inherited from them.
Before 1903, before the Wright brothers, people really did say, if God had wanted us to fly, he would have given us wings. After the Wright brothers, what you heard people saying was, gosh, if we can do that, what can't we do? The invention of the airplane just seemed to open a window on all sorts of undreamed of possibilities for the human race. Flight had come to symbolize the things to which we really do aspire. You know, the ability to control your own destiny, the ability to soar over obstacles, whether psychological or geographic, the ability to gain control and maintain control. All of those things are what flight symbolized. And gosh, you know, now we can do it. When I walk around AirVenture and I see all of these great airplanes and so on, the folks whom I think the Wright brothers would have felt most akin to, and I think the folks who sort of most operate like the Wright brothers, are the really imaginative folks. Burt Rutan, for example. People often ask me if the spirit of Wilbur and Orville is alive in America today. And the answer to that is sure. You can see it in people like Burt Rutan.
Burt Rutan is a legend in aircraft design and a virtual folk hero here at OSHKOSH. He burst onto the scene in the 1970s with radical designs for home-built airplanes made of strong, light, shapeable composite materials. Since then, his name has become synonymous with design innovations. His scaled composite facility in Mojave, California has become the world's most productive aerospace prototype development company with clients that include NASA, McDonnell Douglas, and General Motors. In 1987, Rutan's Voyager became the first airplane to fly around the world without stopping or refueling. He's won the Presidential Citizens Medal and the Collier Trophy. His Proteus high-altitude, multi-mission design was included in Time magazine's 100 Best of the Century in 1999.
When people think of the EAA, they think of the OSHKOSH show. And when they think of that, they think of here is the melting pot of everything with aviation. Everything from antiques and ultralights up to modern equipment and all of these wonderful experimenters who bring their custom-built airplanes. And here's where innovation is. You see more innovation at OSHKOSH than you do at the rest of the shows in the world combined. And a lot of people get their inspiration from OSHKOSH. I can mention in my tent talk at OSHKOSH, for example, a need for something that for general aviation, like synthetic vision or audio in the cockpit or something. And sure enough, people will get inspired by that and go home and work on it. This happened many times. And they come there looking not just for ideas, they come looking for encouragement.
And just seeing what can go in a general aviation aircraft panels today just blows my mind. We didn't have that in Gulfstreams and stuff like that. We had round gauges, you know, and now all these flat panel things that will go in your, you know, whatever airplane is out here today. It's just amazing, amazing. Come a long way.
Another reason OSHKOSH attracts so many annual visitors is the opportunity to get up close and personal with state-of-the-art airplanes from every facet of aviation, such as this huge French Super Transport. Slightly larger than the Boeing Super Guppy is this Airbus A300. It is a highly modified aircraft called the Beluga, and it is the only aircraft in the world that can carry a cargo up to 50,000 cubic feet with 16 by 16 crossfoot sections. Now, just above the cockpit is the upward opening door. It extends to reveal a cargo deck that is 23 by 123 feet. The ability to see cutting-edge aircraft and aircraft components and to exchange ideas has and will continue to fuel major innovation in aviation for decades to come. A common term for all of the building, restoring, designing, and flying of aircraft for self-fulfillment is recreational aviation. And certainly much of what goes on during AirVenture is recreational in nature. But if we think of it as an unbroken continuum of discovery that dates back to Orville and Wilbur, it becomes apparent that the health of this recreational movement has serious implication for America's continued leadership of aviation moving into flight's second century.
First of all, aviation represents about 8 or 9% of our gross domestic product. And if it hadn't been for what Orville and Wilbur did, we wouldn't have commercial aviation today. We wouldn't have the technology that our military aircraft utilizes. So what we have here in terms of EAA, people starting out doing things on their own just really generate ideas, innovation that becomes at some point commercial.
I think that the U.S. achieved leadership and has maintained it by our ability, our freedom to innovate, to take risks, to try things. I'm not advocating risky travel for non-participants, but we've been so fortunate that our society and our government, which is a reflection of our society, has not constrained experimentation, both at the basic home builder level and then at the major company. Major companies have tried everything, every configuration of airplane you could think of, every type of power plant, and they continue to do so, where other societies have been perhaps more risk averse and have been unwilling to experiment, spend the money at the same level. As long as we maintain our curiosity and are willing to try new things, I don't see anyone ever overtaking the U.S. in the aviation industry. The people who are engineers and designers at the major aerospace companies, many of them are here. Many of them have built their own airplanes. Many test pilots I know among the industry fly their own airplanes, they modify them, they build their own. So it's hard to know which comes first. Was it the person who built the airplane and then became an important player as a test pilot or a designer, or was it a parallel effort? I think it's probably simply mirror images of two sides of the activity that our society fortunately continues to allow to happen.
As this family of flight gathers for its OSHKOSH 2003 Centennial of Flight reunion, much is said in public forums about the spirit of the Wright brothers. A spirit is not easily articulated, but the Wright brothers played a vital role in shaping the tradition of American aviation simply by who they were and how they worked. The very fact that powered, controlled flight was invented by two small businessmen working in their own shop established the golden rule of American aviation innovation. The next big idea may come from anyone, working anywhere, at any time. That golden rule makes each year's OSHKOSH something of a treasure hunt. What's out there this year that someone has just figured out for the first time? For example, the use of composite fabrics in the construction of aircraft airframes was pioneered by EAA home builders in the 1970s. It's making big news in certified aircraft construction today.
The use of composite materials in aircraft construction has really revolutionized aviation in the last 30 years. Lighter, stronger, more shapeable materials like carbon fiber have resulted in aircraft that can carry heavier payloads. They're also more aerodynamically efficient, and the lifespan is longer than craft that are made primarily of wood, aluminum, or fabric. The development of composites is key to a new class of business jet that is more affordable and more efficient, like the one you see here by Atom Aircraft. This company out of Inglewood, Colorado, expects this jet to be certified for manufacture in 2004.
This kind of aviation innovation is of critical importance to the nation's transportation infrastructure and economy.
General aviation in this country, I think, is a real engine on the economy in communities all over. This coming week, I'm going to be in Alaska. And when you look at the absolute criticality of general aviation in Alaska, no roads, tough terrain, circumstances where school children and medical supplies are all relying on general aviation to get where it's necessary. It's just one example of how I think that general aviation is a fundamental part of our economy as well as of course, our culture and what I regard as our basic freedoms in terms of a freedom to fly.
According to the General Aviation Manufacturers Association, general aviation, defined as all aviation other than commercial and military aviation, flies over 29 million hours, nearly 2 times the airline flight hours, and carries 166 million passengers annually. General aviation is relied on exclusively by more than 5,000 communities for their air transportation needs. Scheduled airlines serve less than 500. Nearly 70% of the hours flown by general aviation are for business and commercial purposes. Not surprisingly, OSHKOSH has evolved into a major business meeting for general aviation. Nearly 800 commercial exhibitors are here. And sponsorship is provided by some of the biggest names in consumer product marketing.
I don't think the Wright brothers or any of the early aviation pioneers could have ever anticipated what general aviation has become, particularly the personal and business transportation that's available where you can fly essentially where you want to, whenever you want to, for whatever reason you want to.
What general aviation has become is big business. According to Gamma, more than 2,500 new general aviation airframes were shipped in 2002. Their value totaled nearly $12 billion. But the manufacture of new aircraft represents only a tiny fraction of the huge economic activity generated by general aviation annually. Old airplanes are a little like old houses. They are not necessarily replaced, but are constantly refurbished, upgraded, and refined.
The real business is keeping airplanes flying and useful over many years and many decades, in fact. And so the majority of what goes on here and across the GA industry is what I would call refurbishment, refinement, and support. So what we have are people taking an airplane that's going to exist for a long time and applying maintenance to it, replacing the things that wear, everything that wears on an airplane, engines, bearings, all are replaced on a regular schedule. Then it's refined when new technology develops, what we see primarily as electronics. Those are portable. And so every so often, and the cycle seems to be increasing every few years, a new capability is available at a cost and a size that fits more and more airplanes. So then that is installed in the existing fleet. And then finally, there is the overhaul business, the major overhaul where interiors and paint and just a complete refurbishment returns the airplane to like new status. So if I had to guess, I would think that the new airplane business is perhaps 10% of the total, and 90% of all the other dollars flowing through our activity would be in this support, refurbishment, refinement activity.
A large percentage of the nearly 250,000 airplanes in the U.S. general aviation fleet enjoy virtually limitless lifespans through these support, refurbishment, and refinement activities.
The DC-3, built in 1945, was at one point the backbone of the FAA's inspection fleet. Over the years, however, those numbers diminished, and soon this aircraft, N-34, was the only remaining member of that original fleet. But FAA employees who had worked with the airplane decided to donate their own time to save it and restore it. They even took the plane back to its original paint and color scheme.
With a lot of volunteers and about, I think, less than 200,000, we were able to preserve this aircraft. And now, starting on the 7th of July, it started on a tour of cities across the country in celebration of the centennial of flight, and ending up on the 17th of December 2003 in Kitty Hawk. So I'm really proud that I was part of that effort to preserve this DC-3.
Just as one can trace a century of evolution of the airplane by attending AirVenture 2003, a century of piloting can be traced as well. In just 100 years since the invention of flight, the romanticism associated with those who fly has come to rival that attributed to the age of chivalry, the Renaissance, or the early American West.
Throughout the history of the 20th century, flight, one of the reasons there was such enthusiasm for flight was because it did seem to represent all of those things to which we aspired. And the people who did it became the people we most admired because they could do that. They had gained the ability to fly.
In part, that view of pilots and piloting originates from the very design of the Wright brothers' first powered airplane. The 1903 Flyer provided for control over all 3 degrees of freedom: pitch, roll, and yaw, and in doing so made piloting skill an integral part of manned flight going forward. One of the most popular features of the Countdown to Kitty Hawk display at OSHKOSH is the bank of flight simulators, developed in conjunction with Microsoft Flight Simulator, which allows today's pilots to try their hand at flying the 1903 machine, just as Wilbur and Orville did.
It was a very unique experience. The cradle for the bank was very different than I'm used to.
It was difficult, a little bit more than I would have thought.
The insight into what would ultimately be required to control an airplane in flight sprang from the Wright brothers' bicycling experience.
One of their abilities was this capacity that they had to transfer ideas from one technology to another. At the turn of the century, talking about issues of control, how you're going to control an airplane if you ever do get it in the air, most people, flying machine experimenters, assumed that, you know, gosh, this thing is, it's going to be as though this thing is balanced on the head of a pin. It can move in any direction at any time, and that's impossible. It would drive a pilot crazy. Nobody could do that. But the Wright brothers, bike riders and bike mechanics, said to themselves, you know, if you think about trying to explain how to ride a bicycle to a Martian or somebody who's never seen a bicycle before, it's going to be something like what? You want me to roll downhill on these 2 narrow, thin little things, and I have to balance from side to side, and I have to pedal, and I have these handlebars. You know, it would sound as though you had to be the world's finest acrobat to ride a bike. But the Wrights knew that wasn't the case. They knew that once you internalized how to ride a bike, it became automatic. And they knew that the same thing would happen with an airplane. control was what it was all about, Wilbur would say in the end. And in the end, after all, they never did patent the powered flying machine. They patented a glider that exhibited their control system, because they knew that that's really what the core of their idea was, and that nobody else was going to be able to fly without some part of what they had developed in terms of control.
All of those early experimenters in flight knew that a pilot must be able to move the nose of his airplane up or down. This movement is called pitch. And to the left and right, this movement is known as yaw. The patented breakthrough developed by the Wright brothers was a means of controlling the roll axis. The Wrights achieved this three-dimensional control by allowing the pilot to change the shape or warp of the wings. This wing warping was the forerunner of the aileron. Control, control, control. The ability to make the airplane do precisely what the pilot intends remains one of the most admired skills and the strongest senses of accomplishment among OSHKOSH attendees. Piloting and the appreciation of piloting is one of the major ties that binds this family of flight. Because we have accomplished so much in aviation in so little time, a wide variety of piloting experiences are common to a great many pilots who are still flying today. Like Charles Lindbergh and others, many who started their careers flying the open cockpit craft of post-World War I ended them flying jets. This commonality of experience adds to the sense of community.
He flew when aviators' life expectancy was very low, and he lost a lot of friends, and he learned from it. He learned to, do checklists. Those things that killed the other pilots, well, he was going to look at that each time, and he took tremendous risks when he was young, but he developed risk management strategies before those names were popular, and was able to survive, a lifetime of flying from Jennies to jets. And he flew P-38s in the war and Corsairs, and he absolutely loved flying. And at the end of his life, when he was 70 years old, he went up flying in a Piper Cub, and my aunt's husband took photographs of the Vermont countryside, and I think he had been away from small aviation for a long time, and it really reconnected him with his roots, because flying is freedom.
We at Flying and other parts of the industry have tried to determine why a person becomes a pilot. And invariably, when research has been done, the answer is overwhelmingly, and I'm talking 98 to 90%, I don't know, I always wanted to. Almost no one can point to a single crystallizing event that built in the desire to become a pilot. And I find that very interesting, and I certainly know that that's true. In my case, I cannot remember never wanting to fly. I'm not sure how we sustain that, but I don't know that that's a bad news story. I think that it's before the Wright brothers, with the Wright brothers, and now continues with us. The fascination with flight is so basic to humans that it will continue.
And it does continue as the thousands of pilots and enthusiasts who venture to OSHKOSH each year bear witness.
Became a pilot through a good friend of mine. He was actually a home builder, and he built his own aerobatic aircraft. And when we moved to Canada from Germany, it was a fascinating thing for me, and he kind of dragged me along to get my pilot's license. We flew a lot together, and that's how it all started. And I think once you're up, you never want to come down.
I'm working on earning my commercial pilot certificate. I'm at University of Illinois, and so I've just about finished the first half of the commercial pilot course. My past flight instructors have told me that I need a life outside of flying, so I don't get to fly as often as I like all the time, but I spend just about all my time either flying or hanging out at the airport.
This annual OSHKOSH gathering provides an incredible opportunity for pilots from all walks of life to celebrate their common passion and experiences. Many military pilots and crew members also take part to show off their high-tech hardware and share their unique perspective on the wonder of flight.
We're with the 1st of the 147th Command Aviation Battalion out of Madison, Wisconsin. I personally am in Alpha Company, and I am a crew chief with this helicopter, sir. People don't normally get a chance to get this close to military aircraft, sir, and anywhere we go where we encounter civilians, we're generally performing some public relation duties and explaining what we do and what the helicopter is and its capability. So it's an opportunity for them, and it's an opportunity for us.
Just 90 days ago, Air National Guard pilot Ray Fowler was flying an F-16 in Operation Iraqi Freedom. He's returned to OSHKOSH, where he's been a volunteer warbird pilot for years.
I started flying at Fulton County Airport and went through all my commercial ratings, my instrument rating and all that right out of Atlanta, and started flying commercially by the time I was about 18 or 19 years old. Much of what we did is still classified and may not ever be disclosed. One thing we can say from our classified location, we were able to support special forces, in which the F-16 is excellent for that. We were also working with our intelligence sources, doing counter-scud operations and looking for weapons throughout Iraq.
For so many pilots, it's not about getting anywhere. Rather, the flying is an end in itself, whether it's Piper Cubs, home-builts, F-14s, or space shuttles. This celebration of the flying activity draws the largest names in aviation to OSHKOSH every year.
I can't imagine myself ever walking away from airplanes and saying, okay, I'm done flying. I got to do that and I'm through with it. I plan on flying as long as I live and as long as I'm able.
Hoot Gibson has one of the most impressive resumes in aviation. A private pilot at 17, a fighter pilot with more than 300 carrier landings in Southeast Asia, a graduate of the U.S. Naval Test Pilot School, a former NASA chief astronaut, a veteran of 5 missions. Hoot is the only astronaut to serve as mission commander on 4 different shuttles and was recently inducted into the Astronaut Hall of Fame. He is currently a captain for Southwest Airlines. His hobbies are home building and air racing. He never misses OSHKOSH.
I like coming to AirVenture because it's the world's largest aviation convention. And we think of it sometimes as a fly-in, but it isn't just a fly-in, it's a convention. And it is an exchange of ideas, it's an exchange of technology, and it's hey, look at what you can do now. Look at the electronic gadgets you can work with. Look at the airplanes that you can work with. And there is a dialogue between the aviators, which is a wonderful thing to have. There's an old expression in aviation that says you should learn from other people's mistakes because you won't live long enough to make them all yourself. And there is definitely a safety interchange, there's a technology interchange, there's a learning interchange. It's a wonderful venue.
Throughout flight's first century, it has often been the young who were first to fall under the spell of the sky. The nurturing and inspiration of the next generation of flight lovers has long been a characteristic of the aviation community. One of the largest youth programs in the nation in terms of participation is EAA's 10-year-old Young Eagles program, which uses a simple formula of exposing young people to flight in order to inspire them.
When we developed Young Eagles with the goal of flying 1 million kids, most didn't believe the organization could do it. That's over 230 children a day, every day of the year for 11 years.
Through its chapter network and the volunteerism of some 30,000 pilots, well over 900,000 kids have been flown. The flight of the 1 millionth Young Eagle will be part of the centennial ceremonies at Kitty Hawk. He or she will be flown by General Chuck Yeager, chairman of the program. However, the future of OSHKOSH and recreational aviation is not just about the kids.
I think that flying in AirVenture will and need to follow a similar path into the future. And our focus, majority-wise, needs to be on people who are actively involved. but it also has to have a significant part of our coverage and our interest and our resources directed at people who merely have an interest or an enthusiasm and may someday become active participants.
In large part, it seems America's continued aviation leadership in the new century will depend upon widespread participation. And participation is what OSHKOSH and EAA symbolize.
If I had to say to the broad audience of general aviation pilots and passengers, a lot of the folks who are here at AirVenture this week, what I think is most important, it's of course number one, to get out there and fly, to encourage neighbors, friends, to talk in terms of the fact that the barriers to becoming engaged in aviation and in flying are lower than they have been, and it's going to be something that people can afford and will be able to do.
Symbolic of the ongoing commitment to breaking down those barriers is the ride FAA Administrator Blakey took during OSHKOSH in an airplane typical of those which would be included in the newly proposed light sport aircraft category.
The Sport Pilot Initiative is a new set of regulations that the federal government will be implementing soon. It really applies to both pilots and pilot credentials as well as to aircraft and the production of aircraft and the use of aircraft. For the pilots, it's an opportunity for access to recreational flying, just fun, daytime flying in uncontrolled airspace that makes the appropriate level of regulations for the appropriate level of safety that's necessary for that type of flying.
All the work that has gone into the light sport aircraft rule and the sport pilot rule is something that will pay off, and will pay off tremendously in the long run, because it does put a regulatory or safety framework around a growing and a very important aspect of aviation.
The big news at this year's AirVenture OSHKOSH is, of course, the centennial of flight. But these annual visits are not driven by news events. They are part of a continuum of a fascination with wings that isn't always easy to articulate.
The 100-year anniversary makes it a little more exciting, realizing where we've come in the last 100 years. We've come from laying on a wing, trying to fly a little flyer, to going to the moon and back, and it's just exciting to have seen all the things that were happening in here to represent the 100 years of flight. I think that helped, but I'll be back 101 years next year too.
Dr. Tom Crouch of the National Air and Space Museum puts it this way.
I work in sort of the shrine of the aerospace age. Right. Every year, in an average year, 10 million people will walk through the doors of the National Air and Space Museum, which leads me to suspect that the real reason all those people come, when you stand way back and look at it, is because flight sort of makes them proud to be human. Gosh, we did that. You know, my fellow beings did that. We actually built these things. And in a century, we went from Kitty Hawk to the moon. We really did. And I think that's part of the level of enthusiasm for flight in general, and certainly why a lot of people come to that museum. And why people stream to places like AirVenture, too. People who are normal Joe and Jane citizens who don't fly necessarily. Still, you know, it makes you feel good to be human, to see what your fellow beings do at a place like this.
I think there is a community of flight. I think there's a community of aviators out there that's an absolute continuum back to the Wright brothers, back to glider pilots before that, some of the balloonists. I mean, and when you look at correspondence from those days, when you look at the letters they wrote back and forth, sharing ideas, disappointments, you know, the kind of achievements that perhaps at the time really weren't noticed, I think you're seeing that same kind of conversation that's continuing here at AirVenture. And as you talk with people about it, it's the excitement, it's the horizon that they see, it's where they can take this, but it is how they can take this together, because it is a community.
It would have been virtually impossible to predict the incredible progress of flight's first 100 years. The events of OSHKOSH 2003 dramatically illustrate that. Here this week are descendants of the Wright brothers who knew and remembered them. Here this week, the first man to go faster than the speed of sound is giving airplane rides to children. Here this week, the first man to go twice the speed of sound is training the pilots who will fly the 1903 reproduction at Kitty Hawk. Here this week, the first man to step onto the moon is celebrating the birth of flight. Here this week, the administrator of the FAA is issuing an airworthiness certificate to a reproduction of the first powered airplane. Here this week, the U.S. Secretary of Transportation is inspecting an historic airplane restoration. And here this week, just 100 years after Kitty Hawk, is a picture of it all taken from the International Space Station.
So, flight's second century begins much the same as its first. We still believe that the possibilities are as infinite as the sky itself. This dream of flight, which is at least as old as our recorded history, seems so connected to our natural need to better ourselves. In fact, Plato wrote centuries ago, the natural function of the wing is to soar upwards and carry that which is heavy up to the place where dwells the race of gods. The dream will keep them coming back here to OSHKOSH year after year, if for no other reason than so they can learn from each other and better themselves.